Welcome to Into the Mind of Gen Z, a podcast where I take a look at scientific studies discussing the unique challenges and identity shifts that Gen Z goes through and what the science says about how it affects our mind. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Marco Mai, and today we're going to be talking a little bit more about loneliness as I have in the past few episodes, because as I've continued to do more research into the topic, I found that it's a very core issue within today's society. Specifically, today I'm going to be talking about how loneliness seems to be a leading cause of addictions, and especially how loneliness is altering our brain in just a very dangerous way. Addictions are a pretty heavy topic, and there's also a lot more to them than just being an addiction. So while I won't be able to cover everything in terms of like professional help necessarily, I hope that I'll at least be able to dig out some of the core issues that we're seeing in kind of the modern world. So it does kind of get to the core of things like social media addiction as opposed to, say, drug addiction. Something that really stood out to me recently was when I was watching a YouTube video and they spoke about how humans are super social at their core. And yeah, we all know this, humans are social animals, but it's really interesting when you start looking at the brain activity. So what they found is that if you take anything like an MRI scan, you'll see that social activity is one of the very few things across any stimulus that will require the entire brain or use the entirety of the brain, at least in some way. Obviously, for you neurobiologists out there, that doesn't mean that every neuron is firing at once, but we do in general see that many different areas of the brain are activating or even interacting with each other. And this makes sense because you need the parts of your brain to listen to speech, to dissect the meaning, to say words back and respond, to think of answers, to bring out stories and memories, to make memories, physical connection or intimacy, and all of these things combine with each other, which further complicate it and really do activate the entire brain for us. However, when you start to think about this in the context of loneliness, that's when you realize just why people bring up all of the random facts about loneliness and why it's so dangerous. So, for example, the stat is how people will say that experiencing chronic loneliness is about as bad as smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day or about 15 cigarettes a day. Because when you think about it, loneliness can deprive us of everything. We're not going to be using all of that brain activity that would normally be being used. So we're not actually dissecting speech. We're not talking to people. We're not making those physical connections. And now it's very detrimental to our health because our brain is suddenly looking for things to do. But how does this play a role in today's world? The loneliness epidemic and specifically addictions like social media. Well, if you're feeling lonely, then you have to find a way to satisfy those needs, right? And one of the best ways to do that is by participating in otherwise addictive behaviors that at least give you some feelings of joy. And so often what we think about are things like drugs, alcohol, smoking, gambling, things that are needing professional support or help for, those common addictions. But more recently, we are seeing a huge increase in actual other addictions, things like social media, things like parasocial relationships, shopping addictions, content consumption, porn addictions. All of these things are a lot more visible and also a lot more common now more than ever. Not only are these things more accessible, but they're also very easy to hide because they can simply seep into our everyday behaviors. It's really easy for us to say that, oh, I don't have a social media addiction, but that's because obviously I'm doing it myself in my own time for like 4 hours in my bed where no one can see me. And that's a lot different from things where people have a gambling addiction and you're wondering where they are and they don't pick up the phone because they're not on their phone, they're so focused on gambling. Sometimes, and the hard part about this is that we don't even realize that we have these issues in the first place. And that can make these addictions even more difficult to deal with. So today, we are going to be talking all about addictions and the role that loneliness plays in it. We'll be talking about studies behind loneliness, the role behind shame and isolation for addictions, stigmas behind addiction, easy access to addictive substances, and also looking at ways to maybe resolve or at least ease our addictions just a little bit. So if any of that excites you, stay seated because we're just about to dive into the mind of Gen Z. One of the most famous TED Talks brings up an excellent study for us to begin our topic. And so, in this famous study, what people would do is that they give this rat two water bottles. They'd give them one water bottle, which was just water, and the other one was laced with heroin or cocaine. And here's the thing, right? If you have a choice between heroin or cocaine and water, yeah, they're probably going to be picking that heroin or cocaine because it's just really addictive. And what they see over time is that the rat would just continue to keep drinking that water, basically in excess until they would die. They keep drinking it and they get this hit of joy from the drug addiction and they overstimulate themselves until they died entirely. But the issue with this study was that the cage was just that. It was a cage. There was no environment, there were no activities, no colors, and very importantly, there were no fellow rats. And so they ran this study again, but they decided to change a little bit of things. Instead of giving them just an empty cage of nothing, they gave the cage some life. They gave the cage some more wheels, some things to do, some hay or whatever it is that rats lay in. And most importantly, they gave them other rat friends to socialize with. And what they found is that no longer would the rat continue to force itself until death by the consumption of the heroin or cocaine. While yes, it would still participate in it a little bit, it wouldn't do it to the point of death. Suddenly, the rat had much better self-control, and it was much more resistant to actually developing the addiction in the first place. And this was a really great study because there was a ton of follow-up studies on this to show even more effects what happens when specifically it was loneliness and isolation and how that changes addiction. So, for example, acute short-term social isolation can actually cause social memory loss. Social memory is basically the memory that we have related to our social connections. So things like names, stories, conversations, all of these memories get lost when we undergo social isolation. Furthermore, we also see long-term changes to the actual brain itself. So one part of the brain, the amygdala, is strongly associated with activating emotions like anger and fear, as well as rewarding some things for social memory. Under social isolation, the amygdala undergoes some protein changes, resulting in a loss of social memory formation. And so as a result, you might be unavailable to remember social preferences of people that you meet. The good news is, though, that after you regroup or you reintroduce social behaviors, it's possible for all of these changes, so for these social memories as well as the protein changes, to reverse over a couple of days. And that is just one study which showed a lot of things, like increased reception to visceral pain, anxiety, and stress. But ultimately, the main point is that, again, social reward, social behaviors, and understanding what it means for humans to be social animals is really important. You can tackle it from really any perspective that you want, whether it's psychology, evolution, sociology, anthropology, history. What you want to understand is that socialization is a key aspect of how we as humans live and thrive. Socialization activates so many parts of our brain, which are integral to us looking for things like gratitude, the proliferation of our species, joy, belonging, the search for resources, and more. The lack of socialization can therefore just cause a lot of issues for us, like addictions. We also should probably clarify what addictions are. And I do want to do this just because I want to separate it from something like a hyperfixation, because I think that that word is a little bit overused in today's world. The easiest way to understand this is that addictions relate to a chronic relapsing disorder that you return to even though it's unhealthy. Most of the time, this is characterized by drug use, although obviously this isn't always the case. Addictions are also characterized by poor feelings when you go without that addiction for a long time. So feelings of anxiety, distress, or aggression might come out when you're no longer able to access that particular thing. And this is something I really want to emphasize. How many of you have actually gone a day without your phone on you? How many times have you gone a day without going on social media? And I'll say this for one, because when I watched a video on this, it was many, many years ago, even way before COVID and way before the social media and short-term content, all these things. A woman got her pulse scanned and they're seeing how she'd react to notifications on her phone. And they found that when her phone was away from her and when a notification went off especially, Her physiological signals like heart rate and perspiration skyrocketed and were similar to anxiety. This was a really good example of someone who wasn't aware of it, but she actually had a sign of some issues with her phone. I'd hesitate to say that it's an addiction because I'm sure that many of you also have this issue where sometimes you're working and then suddenly you feel like you want to grab your phone or something, and then you realize it's in the other room and you feel a sense of discomfort, but you don't necessarily feel like you're going to have a panic attack. However, I think that that feeling itself, even if it's not addiction, it shows a sign of dependency on our phone. It shows a sign of dependency on the things that we have in our life, which may again not go as far as being an addict or a hyperfixation, but it might show a bit of unhealthy attachment to our device. For a majority of us, we likely don't actually have any clinical addictions or hyperfixations, which is a good thing because no one wants to be addicted to something to the point where it's going to destroy our life. However, I think it's fair to say that a lot of us likely do have that unhealthy attachment, whether it be to our phone, to social media, or whatever else. I'm sure that if you're like me, you know you're not actually addicted to something, but you divulge yourself in it a little bit more than you probably should. On the other hand, according to Sandstone Care, hyperfixations are characterized by complete immersion into something, typically for hours or days at a time, but it can happen for several days and also even months. Unlike addictions, you typically don't relapse into them though. Instead, you might hit a wall and you'll have a total loss of interest towards that fixation. And although that spark can come again, it's less so a relapse and more so a reinvigoration toward that particular interest in another fixated fashion. The reason I wanted to bring up this distinction is because I'm not sure why, but I kind of feel like there's a really big romanticized effort where people say, oh, I'm hyperfixated on this or this, but that's not a great thing. Yes, while anyone can get hyperfixations, there's a reason why it's mostly neurodivergent have this issue with hyperfixations. And they also come with similar issues like addictions or obsessions. You might start neglecting aspects of your life, like your relationships, like your career, your other interests, or even taking care of your body. Sometimes still, it's also used as a coping mechanism, and not in a healthy way. You become so involved or obsessed with your fixation that without it, you feel a sense of dread and you constantly need to go back to it, or else you feel at risk of feeling bad again. This is really what a hyperfixation is. And this is more often true to the underlying nature of hyperfixations. And it's used to bury or avoid feelings that can come behind larger issues, like again, ADHD, but also depression or anxiety. In this scenario, hyperfixations can genuinely be just as harmful as addictions. So keep that in mind. And also, I hope that it makes you a little bit more mindful of the way that you're using the language, just because I don't think it's something that we should be spreading as everyone has one. Obviously, addictions or using anything to avoid our feelings isn't a healthy coping mechanism. And I've spoken about this before, but by choosing to not address the actual issue, you allow those negative feelings to ruminate and exist inside of you without ever dealing with them. And this can very easily cause us to also go into a cycle of loneliness. We might get into isolation because we don't feel understood. And sometimes it actually goes as far as to saying that you don't want to be understood. Some people will develop the mindset that because other people won't understand their struggles, they don't even want to connect with others and attempt to understand that with other people. They'd rather find refuge through their immediate joys that are available to them. And as I spoke about earlier, social isolation makes us more prone to those addictive behaviors, and it makes us less inclined to focus on that issue or resolve it because we continue to spiral deeper and deeper into that isolation. And so now you can see where this issue is, because if you're feeling really bad and you don't actually deal with your issue, you might isolate yourself and get fixated on something. But then when you get fixated on it, you start to get isolated and it just continues to cycle over and over. A really unique part of loneliness, though, is also how there's shame with addictions. And I think this is where addiction and loneliness gets really important to understand in today's online world. Shame is interesting because when it comes to addictions, it's not actually that much of a bad thing. We do need to utilize shame because it tells us what is socially acceptable and unacceptable. For example, cancel culture is actually a really good example of the power of shame. In fear of things that can easily spread like wildfire, a lot of us are going to grow up in a world where we feel like we should be really careful with the things that we're going to do. We should be sensitive to the feelings of others, and we should also try to care for other people. And in some ways, this is actually good. The hypothetical fear and shame of certain things that may happen to us prevents us from making otherwise poor decisions. I'm not a fan of cancel culture for a lot of reasons, and I imagine many of you don't love cancel culture either. But one positive that comes out of it is that it allows us to keep others accountable for their actions. And it's also very likely stopped people from potentially making questionable decisions that come into public light. In this way, shame can sometimes help others in the long term, especially when it comes to issues like addictions. And sure, while it's kind of hard to think about that from a cancel culture perspective, it's easier to look at if you saw someone that you matter to you go through it. So, for example, if you saw your best friend, and let's say it's someone that you grew up with all through childhood, high school, university, all together, and you slowly saw them developing issues with alcohol consumption. And on the weekends, they keep drinking, they stop answering your texts, they're going out, they're getting really sloppy, they're getting rude. It'd probably be really hurtful for you. It'd be really hard for you to see that. And even through that, it'd also be really hard for you to drop them entirely. Instead, you're more likely to tell them about those issues. And you're also going to support them and tell them that what they're doing is wrong. You likely wouldn't wholly tell them to continue to be who they are, but you give them this sense of shame. You tell them supportively that, hey, I know that you're better than this, and seeing you participate in this behavior is really disappointing to me because I know that this is an addiction and the way that it's affecting you isn't making you you. And it's this mix of shame and social support that's a really powerful motivator. Even so, sometimes it doesn't work out. But this is again why we see that shame can be such a strong motivator. When people do things like leave marriages because of addictions, that other person who gets left, they realize just how shameful it is, how difficult of an issue that they have, that's what pushes them towards change. A support system, of course, also helps because it fulfills, again, a lot of aspects of our brain. It gives us the ability to feel serotonin, to feel oxytocin, to feel some joy in our lives and connect with others. And over time, it can give us purpose in our life, and through certain experiences can also trigger dopamine releases. It further prevents us from participating in the addiction, and through having purpose, we can realize the issues we have at hand and then make reparations for our actions or for our addictions. I think that shame and social isolation is also interesting for an addiction that's come up a lot more of a concern recently, and that one is going to be porn addiction. This again is where we have to be careful with our definition of addiction because there are differences between fixations, which is typically pretty uncommon with pornography, regular consumption, and addictions. So again, addictions have to be debilitating in some way. They have to have an effect on your relationships, your work, your school, your focus, or something else in a negative way. And in this case, depending on the study, you're going to get ranges of around 5 to 15% of men who report having a severe addiction, and women who typically report much lower. So it's usually around 1 to 5% of the population that reports to having a severe porn addiction. And this makes sense, but I also know that some of you might think to yourself, well, I'll be honest, I know a lot of people who do consume porn, or I feel like it's a higher number. And you'd be right. So this is a pretty crazy stat, but according to Rosser and others in 2012, they estimated that approximately 86 to 96% of men regularly consume porn. So why do people consume porn in the first place? Well, the main thing is obviously stimulation, but ultimately it comes from the desire to basically get a dopamine hit that comes from the visual stimulus. In this way, it's not necessarily unhealthy to watch porn once in a while, but the statistic of regular consumption is where the issue comes in. Sure, even if it isn't disrupting your daily life, if you're actually using pornography on a regular basis, your brain is developing dependencies on that dopaminergic hit, making you eventually develop more reliance on it and also tolerance to it. This is exactly how addictions develop. It's through regular, seemingly non-harmful use that further develops into a reliance, into full codependency, into tolerance, and then they need more and more. This is why people, when they watch porn, they kind of go down a rabbit hole of they need more extreme things to see because otherwise they don't get the same visual stimulus as before. And that's what leads to an addiction. With that stat, I'm not also afraid to admit that I personally have struggled with porn consumption in my life. I'm happy to say that I'm not an addict, but I have consumed it regularly in the past. And the reason that I'm willing to say that is because I personally know that I have social support groups who've heard me say this before, and they supported me through this admittance. And that allowed me to work through this issue. However, for many others, admitting to having a problem like porn consumption is a really big act of vulnerability. And it's not just because you're admitting to your issue, it's because you risk the chance of losing everything. It doesn't even need to be a severe addiction. Just admitting that you consume porn regularly can make you afraid that people won't look at you the same because, well, you're engaging in what's usually seen as an unhealthy behavior and also sometimes seen as gross. And that can be very stigmatizing. To admit an addiction is already vulnerable and it can be really hard to do, but to admit an addiction that others see as disgusting can come from a place of vulnerability and then further cause you to lose relationships along the way. And that is very scary. It's kind of weird because we do also need this stigma to help us shift people towards healing. So as I said, shame is a really good motivator. People, especially people who are close to you, telling you that, hey, that's weird, is really strong for helping you move along because shame by nature is a social instinct. We developed and evolved to feel guilt and shame in order to recognize what is and is not socially acceptable. So we don't need to get rejected from groups. In this regard, shame is a strong motivator, and often it's the kind of motivation and drive that we need to push things forward in our life. However, this is also where things get kind of confusing. That shame sometimes comes from a place of repulsion, and repulsion can cause social isolation. If this person goes through these issues completely alone, you can see where, again, the issue circulates. They might isolate themselves, and if they feel like they are isolated from others or excluded, then this leads to a greater life of suffocation and suffering. And when you're in that phase, then you want to find something that you can enjoy. And one of the easiest things to do is to circulate back to your addiction because it made you feel good. And so in that regard, sometimes we need to be a little bit kinder to people who are showing us that vulnerability. And equally also for other people to be open to showing that vulnerability. This isn't to say that we need to be kinder to porn in specific. And this is very much because the industry itself is not healthy. But I think that we need to be reframing the way that we approach addicts in general, because the loneliness and social support that comes with it is incredibly important for actually solving these issues for the people around us. Now, I know that seemed like a lot of detail for porn addiction, and I'm going to continue talking about it just for a little bit, but there's a reason for this. According to the Journal of Sex Research, easy access to pornography means that young adults are way more likely to consume it than previous generations. So Gen Z, again, specifically, is the one feeling the brunt of the impact. For male college students, 67% agreed that pornography is an acceptable way to express one's sexuality, while only 37% of their fathers felt the same. Nearly 50% of female college students agreed to this, and this is compared to 20% of their mothers. And I want you to think about that. That is maybe a 2-generation gap, and we're seeing double the numbers of how acceptable it is to express yourself through pornography or consume pornography. And the key here is easy access. Our generation has insanely easy access to dopaminergic hits of all kinds, from social media to content to gaming to porn to personalized videos to obsessions to idols, literally anything and everything you're typically able to obtain with a screen and get it really fast too. That's not to say that all dopamine sources are bad for us or that they're equal to each other. We know that, again, studies from regular porn consumption, these have rates of up to 60% comorbidity with conditions like depression. And so what that means is that if you are regularly consuming porn or you have a porn addiction, then there's a high chance that it's actually happening because of another issue in your life. However, It is to say that all these things are things that we can get attached to very quickly in young adulthood. Most of us were probably on social media at a young age. And a large part of why we're seeing such drastic changes in the perspectives of pornography is because the accessibility of it at a young age. And this is where another issue lies. The age of hyperconsumption is easy to access media at a young age where we develop those dependencies because it releases all those happy chemicals that we end up feeling addicted to. And this is key to remember. It's not that people necessarily consume any content, porn, social media, or whatever else, because they enjoy it specifically. It's because they grew up with it. And it's because that when they grew up with it, it elicited this release of feeling good. And they get addicted to that feeling of feeling good. And so when they grow up with it, it becomes a learned behavior. They start to remember that, oh, I felt good that one time I went on this and I did this, so I'm going to do it behaviorally. It becomes a habit as opposed to something that people actually do out of choice. And this is important because this is also why things like social media and specifically addictions that are easily accessible via online means are something that we can move away from. It's not that our body develops an actual reliance on the activity, but rather the outcome of the activity. This is where and why I wanted to clarify that definition of addiction. Because for a lot of people, you might have heard people say, oh yeah, I got rid of my social media addiction. But sometimes it's not necessarily that they got rid of an entire addiction. It's that they found a way to have purpose in their life and move away from this habit that was actually ruining their life. It's not that our body develops an actual reliance on the activity, but instead we kind of develop a reliance on the outcome of the activity. And so when people find social groups or they support aid in their loneliness, they find that they have amazing producers of happiness. When they have relationships, they feel like they have more purpose in their life. They feel like they have more joy. They have more things to look forward to. And when that happens, we don't need to rely on some of these other things that make us feel better because we already feel good without that indulgence. We have purpose. We have happiness. We just generally feel joy in our lives. We have people to talk to, people to share things with. And that helps us form memories and make connections. And this is why I'm talking so much about how social support and loneliness play such a big role in addictions. Again, this isn't necessarily clinical addictions, but I think that the reason I'm talking about it is because, again, Gen Z is so disproportionately affected by the things like pornography and like social media, unhealthy regular consumption. Shifting more onto the social connective piece, why is loneliness also not only just important, but why is it so important right now? Well, again, this has to do with the loneliness epidemic and all of these things that we're talking about, but I want to give some more scientific views on this. Firstly, I'm going to start with some good news because I just heard about this, which is super, super interesting. And so according to the American Friendship Survey, which is a national survey, Americans at least still generally have quite good friendship outcomes within the past 2 to 3 years. People reported having around 3 to 5 close friends on average. The survey notes that people are still pretty connected with each other, which is a really good thing. And they even go as far to say that the loneliness that we're projecting in media and in society might be an overblown issue. So this is all pretty good news. And it's also a friendly reminder to you that you probably have some more friends or more people that you can reach out to than you think. But of course, there is more to the picture than just the good news. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been just since last November that the World Health Organization nearly declared that loneliness is a global health concern. So even in the American Friendship Survey, which seems to give us a more optimistic look at things, they still noted that over 40% of the participants wished they were closer with their friends, which also indicates a quality of lackluster relationships. This brings me to some interesting studies that we're finding on the effects of social media on our relationships. Social media use has a major benefit, which is going to be connecting with people around the world. Moreover, because you're able to go around the world, you're more able to find people who are like you. And that expands your social circle to people that you can bond with sometimes more easily over your hobbies. In high school, not many of my friends personally played that much video games. And because of social media and because I played games, I had a lot of gaming friends growing up that I met through those online interactions. Now, notably, the way that those online interactions affect our relationship quality is very unique. So, Lugetin in 2022 found that more or less, it depends on the person and how they use social media as a proxy. For instance, those who individually used it to post with others, share content with each other, and regularly would communicate through social media, they would create long lasting connections that would see benefits to the relationship quality. However, those who used it more sparingly just to do things like post stories, not share content with their friends, have posts, and basically only interact asynchronously, such as through comments, they would actually report that their relationship quality wasn't as high. And this quality can further deteriorate based on the number of people that you know and how superficial these connections are. Moving into a globalized path of connecting with others makes your ability to make real bonds and friendships much thinner, and thus you create less meaningful connections. I personally think that a lot of the time when I would play with online friends, it was usually in a group setting. And there's nothing wrong with group settings, but bonding and connecting with them in that group setting, especially online, is a very different experience from connecting with people in face to face scenarios or sharing actual intimate conversations with each other. Both are good and they're normal, and frankly, they're required for a healthy social group. You don't want to just talk about depressing things and the meaning of life every single time that you have a meetup. But it seems that we're more often losing that conversational piece in today's world. Those conversations where you actually develop mutual trust, you share secrets, and you learn about each other in vulnerability become lost. And it's not because you can't have them online, but it's just that having them online can be harder. You're less receptive to social cues, facial expressions, and the physical presence of someone is genuinely important to building those connections. Furthermore, social media, the consumption of it, and the use of it generally promotes having more connections as being better than having strong ones. So, again, for example, on social media, you're rewarded for getting more views, more likes, having more followers, as opposed to having smaller accounts. While, of course, people have their preferences, in a world where you can, and I think people push the narrative really hard that you should monetize everything using social media, it really purports the idea that more is more, even though based on research, we tend to see that having more followers and friends in that way may just be spreading you thinner. And rather than actually giving you relationships and friendships, it actually prevents you from developing more meaningful, long lasting relationships. Again, while we may not necessarily be incredibly lonely, or at least that's what the American Friendship Survey has us to believe, we see that many people do wish that they had deeper connections with their friends. Importantly, the amount of social connections we have and the things we do don't contribute to loneliness. You can feel alone even with a lot of friends. What really matters when it comes to friends is how understood you feel, how you feel that relationship actually plays a role in your life. And that's what we want to talk about when we're approaching loneliness. It's a holistic piece to resolving issues like addiction. And it's interesting because it means that if you use social media as a way to truly connect with your friends and make long-lasting, meaningful friendships, you inversely might be less inclined to use it over time in other ways. Social media becomes exactly what it was intended for, which is a medium used to connect with others. And as a result, you become less inclined to use it for things like posting, like sharing your life, because the reason you're using it now is to build relationships. Of course, this wouldn't be an episode that I made if I wasn't here to offer you a little bit of insight into solutions and actionable approaches to your life to improve the chances of any of your issues. So we're going to dive into some actionable tips that you might want to consider. Firstly, and if this wasn't obvious enough, this episode really doesn't target those big addictions, the ones that we're really used to and seeing genuinely ruin lives. Alcohol, drugs, gambling, or any other serious substance use. If you have any of them, this podcast, unfortunately, I'm not a professional and I can't help you like that, but this is a sign that it's a good time for you to go seek professional help. Just the fact that you're listening to this podcast or whatever else you're listening to is a really good sign, and it shows that you're interested in bettering yourself. However, obviously, as an individual, I just don't have the means to be able to help you, especially across the world and as someone who isn't a professional. Finding professional help is only a couple of clicks away, and searching up things as simple as drug addiction help in Google is all you need to get somewhere. Seek professional help, seek good support groups, and I'm rooting for you. Everyone deserves a life to be free from drudgery, and that includes you and your addictions. Now, on to the thing which is a little bit more suitable probably for the most of us on this topic is surrounding things tackling unhealthy usage of the internet, of technology, of social media, of porn, and whatever else. And I want to part with you the idea that it is autonomy, control, and acceptance of our lives that's really key to solving issues with addiction, especially when it's a little bit less about those clinical signs. So, in a report in 2015, these researchers basically discussed how addictions can be treated by changing the mechanisms involved in self-control. Parts of our brain, such as the anterior cingulate, the adjacent prefrontal cortex, and the striatum, show reduced activity when you are undergoing addiction. And would you know it, all of these parts of the brain are also part of the circuitry for self-control. This probably isn't that unfamiliar to people, as people know that one of the issues is that when you have an addiction and you know it's an issue, it's still hard to control yourself from stopping it. So what they found is that one of the best ways to improve your addiction is by improving your self-control, and especially by targeting the activity in those control networks. What they really wanted to suggest was that behavioral training seemed especially helpful in this. Professional CBT and DBT showed strong results, and they also suggested mindfulness meditation as another way to increase the function of those control networks. I feel like I mention mindfulness a lot as a solution to issues in my episodes, so I'm not going to talk about it too much here, but what they really want to talk about is that when you're mindful and when you accept and when you feel like you actually take responsibility for your actions and you understand that you are a function of not just your thoughts, but everything, your thoughts, your emotions, your actions, and you're really mindful of what you're doing, that actually activates and helps you take control of those same brain parts of your prefrontal cortex. They reactivate and it actually reintroduces that activity. Building the intention to have self-control or feeling like you have control over your behaviors and control over your ability to have self-control is enough to aid recovery from addictions. But let's step away from mindfulness. How does this actually look in other ways? How can we recognize our control over our situation? And so the first thing to do with any addiction or anything that's unhealthy is recognize and accept where you are and what you're doing is unhealthy in the first place. As is with any addiction or any issue, recognition is the first step to the resolution of an issue. It's cliche, but people are right when they say that you can't solve an issue that you can't see. You have to be really honest with yourself, and that's the first step to solving it. But the second step, I think, is where most people actually have a lot of difficulty, which is taking accountability and responsibility for their issue. Oftentimes, people are going to recognize they have an issue, but they're going to choose to not face it because it's hard to deal with, and sometimes it doesn't actually hurt anybody. So I'm thinking about things like a shopping addiction, like a social media addiction, or even a porn addiction. When you do these things in private especially, they're not overtly harmful to anybody. And so we continue in that behavior even if we know that it's not something that's good for us. And this second small part kind of sounds meaningless because basically what I'm saying is you have to make the choice to be accountable and take responsibility for what you are, and there's nothing else you can do. But I mean, if I'm being honest, that's really true. It's really it. There's not really a magic pill to fix your life, to understand everything. And sometimes it can be really difficult because it might be a long process for some people. But equally, taking accountability and responsibility for yourself is a choice. And once you make that choice, it can also be really freeing because it means that you realize that only you are ultimately in control of your life. And that sense of autonomy and control over your life, once you actually feel it, once you actually truly believe in it, can also increase your well being and also strengthen your discipline. So we know that people who feel a general strong internal locus of control feel better about their lives. They have increased well being. They have better motivations. They have stronger drives, and they can actually stick to things that they want to do for longer because no longer are they living their lives passively. They're living their lives with intention. Now, these are the universal first two steps to solving addiction issues. But the third step is a little bit more diverse. One thing with addictions or issues that follow the addiction framework is that they're very dependent on what you're struggling with and why. So, for example, if you're struggling with social media addiction, is it because you're addicted to the external validation? Are you addicted to doom scrolling and feeling like you are actually learning something even though you're not? Are you addicted to porn because of poor impulse control? Or is it that you just watch it when you get bored and you want to feel good? Do you participate in your unhealthy behaviors because you feel like a lack of purpose or you don't have a control over your life? It's understanding these underlying behaviors and these underlying reasons why you're doing something that's the third step that helps you develop an action plan to solve the issue. Furthermore, understanding your issue helps put it on a level playing field with you. Sometimes when you're faced with an issue like this, like social media or porn, it can be really difficult to claw out of. Again, a lot of these things have been ingrained with us at a really young age. And when it comes to the level of addiction, it gets hard to break out because they're so deeply incorporated and ingrained in our lives. Equally, this is where professional help is often really helpful because things like psychotherapy or addiction psychiatry helps diagnose and aid you in understanding the reason behind your actions and your thoughts. Again, this circulates back to having a sense of control in your life and with your issue. When you don't actually understand your issue and you just see to yourself, oh, I have this issue, but you don't understand the reason why, it can be really difficult to understand how to fix it. Suddenly, when you actually do understand it, it becomes a lot smaller than it actually is. You're not only able to see your issue for what it is, but also you have a better sense of feeling like you can actually control your behaviors. I'm going to be talking about porn usage because it's a little bit closer to me, and I think it fits this general topic very well. It'd be a disgrace throughout this entire episode if I wasn't talking about how important social support is with dealing with these issues, because when people participate in unhealthy behaviors, it's because they often have no better substitute for it. So rather than divulge themselves into a certain hobby or a project, they choose something like social media or pornography because it's faster, it's more immediately rewarding than going to the gym or learning how to code. For me personally, it was these friendships and relationships and building purpose back in my life that helped me move out of it. It was feeling like I could build towards a career. It was like feeling that I had projects like this podcast I want to do. It was feeling like I had friendships and relationships that really meant something to me that I would want to work towards. And giving me purpose in my life made it feel like I no longer had an issue with pornography. Because the underlying issue was for me, it was feeling lonely. It was feeling bored. It was feeling like I didn't have things I wanted to live for. Friendships and relationships are what we would consider healthy substitutions because it covers all of these reasons. They give us the foundation of purpose in our life. When you think of purpose, lots of people usually think about things that are related to others. It's why people feel so good when they do things like volunteer, or why people, when you ask them as kids, even they say they want to help other people. They want to contribute to the community. They want to solve bigger problems than themselves to help people. Relationships tend to be a very central component of purpose. And even if it's not necessarily your entire purpose, understanding that there's probably an underlying component of it lets you realize that you have a purpose in relation to other people, and that is how it's going to be related to your addiction. I once heard a psychiatrist say that one of the reasons people get addicted is because, even if it's kind of harsh, you don't have a life that's worth living. And that's not to be mean, but it is true because sometimes you just have a life that isn't worth living. Obviously, it's not that you should give up on your life, but it's to say that people resort to things that make them feel good in the moment because they have nothing that wants to get them out and up out of bed. they don't have passion projects, they don't have hobbies, they don't have works that they want to do, they don't have friendships, relationships, they don't have good relationships with their parents, they don't feel a sense of joy in their everyday life. And so, again, rather than participating in things that give them purpose and make them feel good, the only thing that they know that makes them feel good is the consumption of these other things. Purpose in general is a really finicky topic, but if you feel like you belong somewhere, if you feel like you have friends and a social group to rely on, you're much less inclined to start participating in behaviors like doom scrolling. And again, this is why purpose is really hard, because I think people often have the notion that to have purpose, you have to have something that you marvel at and say that this is exactly what I was meant to do. But it's not about that. Rather, it's that when you wake up, you feel a sense of fulfillment in your life and you feel like there's something that you want to live for. You're going to have moments where you're sad and you're going to feel lost and you're not going to understand yourself. But this is a spoiler alert, but no one knows what they're doing. When your parents had you as a kid, they had no idea how to take care of you as a kid, unless you had an older sibling, but also you're the younger sibling now. And how do you deal with that, right? It's nothing about having a perfect purpose in your life, but rather having that sense of fulfillment, that small direction where you say, I know that I want to live for this because it makes me feel good when I talk to people, when I share secrets, when I work on these projects, when I go out to explore the world. Having something in your life that's worth living for helps prevent you from relying on those quick impulse decisions that make you feel good. Aside from that, of course, social support is important when we talk a bit about everything before. Having a group of people you can turn to about your issues, for people to hold you accountable, and for a group that you can be vulnerable with about your issues is really important. However, I want to be really clear because I think sometimes people hear this thing where if I tell this group, it's going to hold me accountable. But it's not just about telling that group to hold you accountable. It's having that group make actionable steps that result in change. So, for example, it's not just good enough to tell your friends that you have an issue and then expect 2 months down the line that something will change. Change, especially when it comes to unhealthy, regular behaviors, is really hard. So you have to tell your friends exactly what you're going to do, ask for their support, and in many cases, I find that it's really helpful if they also participate in making an action plan for you to follow up on, and then force you to do it. One of the things that we talk about in addiction psychiatry actually is that sometimes action plans for recovery don't need to be voluntary. They can be voluntary for a very short moment where they realize one day they wake up and they say, I need to get rid of this addiction. This is an issue. But then the rest of the days, they might feel like they want to keep going back to it, and their friends or whoever else is going to have to force them to stay on their path. And it's going to suck for that person. But doing that can actually help people in the long term, is what the research says. So when it comes to things like social media, a common one to see success with actionable steps is have your friends be the ones to delete the apps or have them set passwords for time limit locks on social media apps. I've even actually heard stories of people who have their friends set up parental controls for their device. One of the beautiful things about technology is because it's so free and there's so much options to do with it. And so you can find a lot of unique ways to use it to face less negative repercussions. These are just some ideas for you. And if you incorporate them, you're likely to find success because, again, now you're using technology in a unique way. Your friends are holding you accountable. There's actionable steps for you to take, and that's how you can get out of these addictions. The very last thing I want to bring up today is that also don't take all of this advice and addiction stuff as you should take out everything in your life. And hopefully I'm saying this and it doesn't cause you to just think about your behaviors and be like, oh, it's okay. But what I mean by this is that there's, on the other side of the spectrum, some people who think that you should detox yourself from absolutely everything. And I think that if you want to be at your absolute success, if you want to be able to do anything at will, then you can do it. I feel like there's a really big trend on YouTube right now, especially where people talk about how powerful boredom is, and that if you can face boredom, that you can basically do everything. Because if you're really bored, then writing a book or reading a book is a lot better than just doing nothing. However, I also want to remind people that when people were cavemen, when people were living their lives back in the day, it's not like they had phones, and it's also not like they sat there and they would meditate all day. People have to find ways to enjoy their lives and do things that make them feel happy. And that can often include things like social media for us in our day and age, sharing things with others, having good experiences, indulging in games, and doing things like that. The issue is that you have to reflect on yourself and see if there's a balance. Are you spending too much time on this? Are you sacrificing other things? Are you not reaching the goals that you set out to yourself because of your doom scrolling, because you're posting? Is it when you post, are you actually happy? Is it actually sustaining your relationships and changing your life for the better? Those are the reflective questions you need to do in order to understand if you actually have unhealthy usage. When it comes to stuff like this, it's kind of lame because it's a really cop-out answer. But as I continue to do more research and I get older and I learn more, is I always learn that there's a balance. While some people can succeed using a lot of social media and some people can succeed using no social media, I find that the majority of people, they're going to find themselves under this bell curve where they have to use it a little bit and they find joy from it, and that's okay. However, there's again that balance. You don't want to be too far on one end or the other unless that's just the kind of person that you are. And I know that's a really sucky situation to hear from me, because what it means for you is that you need to do reflection. Maybe you do need to actually do that mindfulness meditation. Maybe you do need to start journaling to really understand that and to sit with yourself and know what you want and what you value in life. But I find that when you actually do that, it's really rewarding because suddenly you get that control over your life and you start picking things for yourself. That concludes today's episode. And although today was definitely a bit more of a rambly episode, I hope that you still enjoyed it. If you know someone who might need to take a listen, please do share it with them. I appreciate the support, whether it's through a follow, a 5-star review, or even just shooting me a message. One of my favorite things about doing this is that I get to share research with you guys, and for a lot of you, I get to talk with you about it and really build a connection with you guys. And so I hope to continue to be able to do that for just a bit longer. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to see you all again next week for another episode. So until then, take care.